Get her off the stage. She's black. She's blind. She'll ruin the Steinway. These were the first words Ayana Bell ever heard before touching the piano in front of an audience. But when her fingers moved, the world didn't just hear music, it heard itself. This is not just a story of music. It's the story of what happens when a soul refuses to be invisible. The Harmonique Theatre in Boston was nothing short of majestic. Rows of tuxedoed patrons filled the gilded seats, while velvet curtains swayed like royalty behind the Steinway and Sons grand piano, a sacred object in the classical world. On that stage, music had always belonged to the elite. It was a place where technique triumphed over emotion, where names mattered more than notes. Into this space stepped a 15-year-old girl, blind black unknown. Her name, Ayana Bell. She was not introduced. There was no spotlight cue or formal announcement. She walked slowly with quiet purpose, holding her white cane in one hand and a small sliver of courage in the other. Her dress was plain. Her shoes were soft-soled. She didn't look like a performer. She looked like someone who had entered the wrong world entirely, but she didn't hesitate. She approached the piano and paused, her fingertips hovering just above the glossy keys. Then came the voice. Get her off the stage. She'll ruin the piano. It wasn't from a heckler or an anonymous critic. It came from Nathaniel Royce himself, America's most celebrated pianist, known both for his icy performances and his even colder opinions. His words landed like a slap across the room, echoing not just in sound, but in implication. A chuckle rippled from backstage. Some guests looked away, but no one intervened. Ayana's back straightened. She didn't look toward Royce. She couldn't see him, but she faced the direction his voice had come from, as if to say, I heard you. And then she turned, placed her cane beside the bench, and sat down at the piano. Her posture was steady, her hands trembling only slightly. Every part of her movement seemed to say, I'm here not because I was invited, but because I refuse to leave. As Royce stood frozen, brimming with disapproval, Ayana's fingers touched the first key. The note wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the thick, unspoken bias that filled the room. The sound was clear, round, and filled with a kind of sadness the audience hadn't expected. And just like that, the insults faded, not because they were taken back, but because they were drowned out by something more powerful truth. That single note was the beginning of something no one in that room could have anticipated. A girl who was supposed to fail had just spoken in the only language that could not be interrupted, music. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge Nathaniel Royce. She challenged an entire system of who is allowed to be heard. Long before the stage lights, long before the scorn Ayana Bell was simply a name on a forgotten file at Eastbrook Conservatory. She arrived not in a town car or under a scholarship banner, but in a government-issued van. 13 years old, carrying a cracked braille reader and a white cane taped back together. Her dorm room was a storage closet, rebranded with a bed. She wasn't enrolled. She was a participant in a humanitarian pilot program, one that let her be present but not included. She wasn't allowed to touch the pianos, not even the old ones in the practice hall. She didn't attend official classes or recitals. Instead, Ayana spent her days sitting cross-legged outside room 2B, where harmonic analysis was taught. The corridor became her classroom. Her ears became her textbooks. She learned by listening each step of the professor, each tap on the board, each mistake and correction from inside the room. Her body was the instrument. Her thigh became the staff paper. Her breath marked the rhythm. Other students didn't notice her, or pretended not to. They never yelled. They didn't need to. Silence was sharper. Cold shoulders, tightly closed doors, eyes that passed through her like glass. One evening, a privileged student called her a pet in front of a crowd. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She just stood still, her hand resting gently on the piano, then quietly walked away. But inside her, something had begun to bloom. Not bitterness, not rage, just music. Each night in her dorm, she would retrace every sound from the day. Her fingers moved over the walls as if turning pages. She noticed the way certain floors resonated more than others, how certain window frames sang softly when the wind blew. She began composing in silence, imagining fugues and motifs while others partied or slept. Her world was not empty, it was full, just unheard. Then, one rainy evening, Professor Harold McCain saw her, truly saw her. She was playing an invisible concerto in the air, with her hands no piano, no audience, just memory and movement. He didn't interrupt. He watched. And when she realized someone was near, she flinched. But he simply asked, "Are you listening to my lecture?" She nodded. "I'm just trying to visualize the fugue." That was the moment everything changed. From that night forward, the silent observer was no longer alone. She had no formal teacher, no official enrollment, but for the first time someone at Eastbrook acknowledged that the girl they had ignored could hear things the rest of them had forgotten how to feel. Harold McCain had spent 40 years teaching music at Eastbrook. He had seen talent come and go, but nothing had ever stirred him like the silent passion in Ayana Bell. Their lessons took place in a damp basement storage room far from the echo of polished concert halls. There was no Steinway, just a neglected upright piano that still bore the scars of forgotten practice sessions. But to Ayana, it was sacred. He didn't teach her with syllabi or notation. Instead, he told her stories, how a fugue was a soul chasing itself, how minor chords could be more hopeful than major ones, depending on the silence that came before. He tapped rhythms on her knees. He guided her hands to feel the vibrations of the wood. He taught her to breathe with the music, not count it. It wasn't training, it was translation. He helped her speak the only language the world hadn't taken from her. Ayana learned at an unthinkable pace, not because she had something to prove, but because for her, music wasn't optional. It was survival. She didn't aim for perfection, she aimed for truth. Her fingers absorbed not just melody, but memory. And Harold began to realize he wasn't just teaching. He was being taught how to feel music again, not instruct it. Every note Ayana played was a mirror held to his own forgotten purpose. But the walls of Eastbrook didn't approve. Rumors spread. Whispers in the faculty lounge turned to warnings. The head of the piano department, Clarence Langford, called Harold into his office. "This is not a place for pity experiments," he said, with the weight of legacy behind him. But Harold said nothing. He had already made his decision not to fight the system, but to invest in a soul. Ayana knew none of this. She only knew the music. Her improvisations became more daring. She began composing pieces Harold couldn't explain. She wasn't playing to impress him anymore. She was playing what he hadn't yet dared to say, his regrets, his doubts, his isolation. One day she ended a lesson with a chord so broken and raw, Harold cried without knowing why. It was then he understood she wasn't just his student. She was his redemption. And so the lessons continued, hidden like roots beneath stone. Each note, each breath, each silence was a rebellion not against individuals, but against every locked door that had ever told a child like Ayana, "You don't belong here." And in the quiet of that basement, a revolution began, not with noise, but with the kind of music no audience could ignore forever. In a quiet act of rebellion, Professor Harold McCain submitted Ayana's name to the prestigious Young Virtuoso Showcase without asking anyone for permission. He didn't include glossy photos, letters of endorsement, or her GPA. He didn't mention that she was blind or black, or had never officially been enrolled at Eastbrook. All he submitted was a single audio file, an improvisation Ayana had played in the damp basement on a rainy afternoon. No edits, no enhancements, just the raw, unrepeatable sound of a girl trying to translate silence into music. Weeks passed with no word. Then one day, a terse email arrived. Ayana was invited to audition, not at the main auditorium, not at a respectable hour, but at 7:45 in the morning, in practice room C12, a neglected space with peeling walls, a cracked upright piano, and a single unnamed judge. No welcome letter, no program slot. It wasn't an invitation, it was a message: you are allowed to try, but you will not be seen. Ayana woke up in the cold that morning before sunrise. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't speak. She simply stood by the door in her black dress and waited for Harold, who walked beside her without a word. As they approached the room, he gently squeezed her hand. "This isn't for them to choose you," he whispered. "This is for you to decide if you need them." Ayana nodded her cane, tapping quietly against the floor as she entered. Inside the room was dim and cold. The judge, a tired man with a grey shirt and thin glasses, barely looked up. He scribbled something on a paper and waved a hand as if to say, "Go ahead." The piano's middle pedal stuck. Some of the higher notes buzzed slightly. Ayana didn't flinch. She sat down, slowly placed her cane by the wall, and let her hands rest on the keys, not to begin, but to remember. When she began to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, the room transformed. Each note carried the weight of nights she spent listening to fuzzy radio recordings, memorizing every sound by heart. Unknown to Ayana in the corner of the hallway, Mr. Richard, the aging janitor, who had once mopped floors during the performances of legends, stood silently watching. He had seen countless students come and go, but this girl alone in a broken room with no audience was something else. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an old flip phone, and quietly pressed record. No commentary, no interruption. Just 3 minutes of something that moved him more than any gala had in years. Later that day, Ayana received a one-line email. "We regret to inform you that you have not been selected for the performance showcase." There was no feedback, no reason given, but something far more powerful had already begun. In a quiet corner of the internet on an old music forum, a new post appeared. "Blind girl plays Rachmaninoff in forgotten room. No name, just music." And without knowing it, Ayana had just taken her first step onto a global stage. The rejection from Eastbrook was expected, but it still stung. Harold didn't show her the email. He didn't need to. Ayana could feel it in his silence. She simply sat alone that evening, running her fingers over invisible keys on the wooden table of their small apartment, replaying the audition in her mind. It wasn't disappointment she carried. It was a quiet ache, like the hum left behind when a song fades. She thought the moment had passed, but far beyond her reach that moment was just beginning to unfold. The video posted by Mr. Richard didn't go viral overnight. At first, only a few dozen classical music enthusiasts viewed it, users from forgotten corners of the internet. One comment read, "The sound is a little fuzzy, but something in this girl's hands feels alive." Then a pianist in Argentina, Marcos Viala, known for playing with one hand after a car accident, shared it on his page, writing, "I cried, and I haven't cried for music in 10 years." That was the spark. From there, the wildfire began. Within 72 hours, the video crossed 3 million views. No marketing, no PR team. Just one truth. Ayana's music made people feel again. Deaf artists watched with their hands on speakers, sensing the vibrations. A music blogger from Berlin tweeted, "If Eastbrook can't see her, then they are the ones who are blind." Suddenly, Ayana wasn't a forgotten orphan. She was a mirror held up to a world that had grown too polished to remember what music was for. The video kept spreading, shared in whispers and shouts. Music professors debated it. High school students copied her posture. Street performers began calling out her name, but the most unexpected response came in the form of a single tweet from the International Gala of Human Harmony. "We watched the video. We would like Ayana Bell to open this year's gala." Just like that, the story turned. The girl who had been shoved into a broken practice room was now being asked to stand where the world's greatest voices had once stood. At Eastbrook, the faculty board gathered in stunned silence. Clarence Langford, red-faced and trembling, slammed the table. "This is a social media stunt. A blind girl playing from instinct, no technique." But no one replied. The school's communications director simply turned her laptop to show the tweet. No one could deny it anymore. Ayana wasn't an exception. She was the correction. And in a modest apartment outside Boston, Ayana received an envelope marked with raised braille, "You are invited to open the World Harmony Gala broadcast in over 60 countries." She ran her hands over the textured letters and smiled faintly. Not for the recognition, but for the truth. This time the world had invited her, and she would not come to perform. She would come to speak in the only language she had ever truly known. Crescendo Hall shimmered that evening with chandeliers and anticipation. Cameras buzzed, guests whispered. It was the kind of night reserved for legends. But when Ayana Bell stepped onto that stage, there were no sparkles, no spotlight tricks. Just a girl in a plain black dress, barefoot, carrying an old wooden flute, and the silence of 1,000 stories untold. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply walked to the Steinway and Sons D274, the same model she had once been told she would ruin. She sat quietly, her cane laid beside her, her hands resting on the keys, not to conquer them, but to remember. She didn't play Mozart. She didn't perform Beethoven. Ayana didn't need names. She played a piece, never written, never rehearsed, a melody of broken lullabies, closed doors, and lonely corridors. Her right hand whispered the stories of children told they didn't belong. Her left hand struck the chords of anger, sorrow, and grace. And then silence. For 30 seconds she let the silence speak. The hall didn't move. Royce, watching from the wings, didn't blink. This wasn't music to impress. This was testimony. Each note an indictment. Each pause a scream in stillness. At one point she stopped playing altogether and lifted her mother's flute. The sound it made wasn't perfect, but it was real, fragile, human. It quivered with the weight of all who had been silenced and forgotten. Royce had spent decades defining what good music meant, but as Ayana played, he sat frozen, watching the very foundation of his legacy crumble with every note she pressed. She wasn't rewriting the rules. She was reminding the world that rules had never served the voiceless, and the voiceless had just found their voice. When Ayana finished, she didn't wait for applause. She stood, picked up her flute, and walked away. No encore, no bow, just presence and then absence. But the hall didn't erupt, not right away. They stood slowly, quietly, not to praise her, but to apologize. To apologize for all the times they hadn't listened. And in that stillness, something eternal was born. From that moment on, the question wasn't, who is Ayana Bell? But how did we almost never hear her? She had not played to be accepted. She had played to remind the world how to feel. And as the lights dimmed on Crescendo Hall, they didn't fade to black. They faded to breath. Because the girl who had once been told to get off the stage had just made the whole world stand. In the hours following her performance at the World Harmony Gala, Ayana Bell became a global sensation. News anchors struggled to summarize what they had witnessed. Influencers posted tearful reactions. Music producers flooded inboxes with seven-figure offers, urgent meetings, and promises of stardom. Talk shows cleared their primetime slots for her. Magazines prepared special covers. But while the world shouted her name, Ayana fell silent. She didn't attend press conferences. She didn't answer calls. She didn't post a word. Instead, she left the hotel room quietly at dawn, carrying only her white cane, her mother's wooden flute, and a small suitcase. She boarded a train with Professor Harold McCain beside her, vanishing from public view. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Rumors swirled, but Ayana didn't reappear on any stage, in any spotlight, or on any screen. She didn't disappear out of fear. She simply knew the performance wasn't the destination, it was the door. What remained behind were pieces of music, handwritten, unpublished, unsigned. They began arriving in places no record label would ever go: prisons, refugee camps, children's hospitals, shelters, hospice rooms. Each one was written on thick old paper with ink that bled slightly when touched by tears. Some had no title. Others had names like The Breath You Left Behind or The Wall Remembers. There was never a return address. One inmate in Georgia said he cried for the first time in 17 years after playing a score sent anonymously to his cell. A mother grieving her child opened an envelope with a melody so delicate it felt like her son's final breath. A young girl battling cancer in a silent ward clutched a Braille score titled Still With You. No one needed confirmation. They knew these were Ayana's letters, not written in words but in resonance. She didn't ask for acknowledgement. She didn't attach instructions. She trusted the music to find the listener it was meant for. And in a world obsessed with credit and branding, she became the ghost in the melody, the invisible force reminding us that healing doesn't need a spotlight, just a heartbeat and a listener willing to hear it. And so, while others chased platforms and applause, Ayana chose presence over fame. Her silence spoke louder than any viral headline. She proved that music doesn't have to be sold to be shared. It doesn't need to be streamed to be remembered. It just needs to be real enough to find someone who thought they'd been forgotten. And that perhaps was her loudest performance of all. Years passed. Ayana's name rarely appeared in trending searches or headlines. But in quiet corners of the world, change was taking root, planted by her presence, nurtured by her absence. In Ghana, a small music school named a children's percussion class, the Bell Rhythm Circle. In Vietnam, a teacher of the visually impaired created a class called Listening with the Skin. None of these places had met her, but they had felt her. At Eastbrook Conservatory, the tides had turned. After years of public pressure and internal reckoning, the board finally approved a new department, not out of pity, but out of humility. It wasn't named after Ayana directly. It was simply called Bell Wing. No statue, no portrait. Just a quiet space designed for those who didn't fit the traditional mold. Classrooms with sensory soundboards, hallways with no steps, a courtyard with a smooth stone wall etched in braille silence is not the absence of sound. It is where everything waits to be heard. No one led the ribbon-cutting ceremony with fanfare, no orchestra played, but hundreds of new students, many disabled, many previously dismissed, began their musical journeys there. They didn't learn music theory first. They learned how to listen, to others, to space, to silence, and to themselves. That was Ayana's curriculum, though no one ever called it that. In a modest apartment near the river, an elderly man named Nathaniel Royce still sat each morning at his piano. He no longer performed in grand halls. He no longer judged competitions. He no longer played to be seen. On his stand sat a sheet of music he couldn't read, written in braille, but he had memorized the notes. And every day, with trembling hands, he played it not for an audience, but for penance. To remember what he had once forgotten music is not for dominance. It is for truth. When asked in an interview about Ayana, Bell Royce didn't offer excuses. He simply said, "She played what I never dared to. And when she did, she saved me." No grand apologies. No public redemption arc. Just one man who had once blocked her path, now walking behind her echo. And so Ayana's name was not engraved on trophies. It lived instead in new doors, opened in new songs written by hands once told they'd never matter, and in the way Royce, the once frozen heart of American classical music, had finally begun to melt. Her legacy was not in being heard, it was in helping others find the courage to speak, even if only in silence. Somewhere in a small village in Kenya, children learned rhythm by scattering rice on wooden floors and stepping barefoot. In a mountaintop retreat in Bhutan, a blind girl guided others by listening to the way the wind moved between pine trees. These weren't music schools. They were spaces of feeling. And in every corner, one unspoken rumor spread: Ayana Bell was here. She never confirmed her presence. She didn't teach through lectures or lesson plans. She showed up when someone needed to believe that silence could still speak. Her melodies began to surface again, but never in concert halls. Instead, they rose inside churches with no microphones, on subway platforms where street performers played to no one, in hospital waiting rooms where an old nurse quietly played a piano piece with trembling fingers and tears in her eyes. There were no signatures on the sheet music, no composed by, no Spotify tracks, just fragments of emotion, melodies that lingered like breath. A lullaby in a war zone, a minor chord in a refugee camp, a 7-note song titled For Those Who Weren't Chosen. No one asked, "Is this Ayana's?" They didn't need to. They simply listened, and in listening, they felt seen. In New Orleans, a young man who had once been mute wrote music using heartbeat rhythms recorded on his phone. He called it the sound of stillness. In Norway, deaf children painted color-coded music by tracing vibrations. In Japan, an elderly man, long estranged from his family, played a tune that helped him remember his wife's laugh. All of them said the same thing when asked where they learned it. We didn't. We just heard it somewhere. Ayana didn't seek legacy. She didn't seek credit. She sought moments, tiny cracks in the surface of the world, where something honest could bloom, where someone forgotten could finally feel felt. Her melodies weren't compositions. They were mirrors. And every person who played one found something they hadn't known was missing. She was never there for the applause, but she was always there when someone needed to be reminded they still had a voice, even if it didn't come with words. Ayana didn't play to be known. She played so that others might feel they weren't invisible anymore. 1 year after the gala, the Royal Council of Arts held a special assembly. At the end of the session, they unveiled a new name for the most prestigious award in music, the Ayana Bell Honor, a prize to be given not for technique or fame, but for those who dare to redefine what sound means. It would be awarded once every decade, and only to those whose music doesn't conquer but connects. In a small temple in Bhutan, monks discovered a handwritten score left behind on the altar. It had no title, no date, no signature, just a line written in soft braille. If you hear something in the silence, then I was once here. The melody played that day was barely audible, but it brought grown men to tears, because it reminded them that presence doesn't require volume, only truth. And now, as you sit here, perhaps in your home, perhaps with your eyes closed, ask yourself something simple. Have you ever heard a melody that didn't come from sound but from silence? From a moment when everything else stopped and something deep inside you spoke not in words but in rhythm? If you have, then you already understand Ayana's music. And if you haven't yet, maybe today is the first note of that song. Because music is not what's played, it's what's felt. It's not found on stages or screens, but in the space between your heartbeat and your breath. Ayana Bell didn't set out to become a legend. She only hoped one person might feel less invisible. But in doing so, she taught the whole world how to listen again, not with their ears, but with their hearts. So take a moment. Sit still. Close your eyes. Listen. Not for perfection, not for performance, but for what's been waiting inside you all along. Because there are some melodies that live inside the silence, and they're just waiting for someone brave enough to begin. If this story touched something inside, you share it with someone who might be needing to hear their own song again. Comment below. What is the one sound that brings you back to yourself? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're not just telling stories, we're remembering how to feel. One note at a time.